Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 One Book, One Community author event for Idea Exchange. My name is Shannon Markle, and it's my great pleasure to roll out the virtual red carpet this evening for our 20th oboc author event. But before we begin tonight, we'd like to acknowledge that Waterloo Region is on the land of Indigenous peoples dating back countless generations. This land is part of the Haldimand Tract, the traditional land of the Six Nations of the Grand River and Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And as we gather virtually tonight, we recognize that the many places from which we gather are home to many First Nations, Métis and Inuit, who continue to live and work here today. Acknowledging reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendship of Indigenous people, and so each one of us bears personal responsibility in reconciliation. We are grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and enjoy this world around us, and we are mindful of the need to reconcile with our Indigenous allies. We are committed to working together to make the promise of truth and reconciliation real in our community. 20 years of reading together as a community is a remarkable achievement, and it is fitting that this evening's discussion will be a conversation with Canadian icon Peter Mansbridge and his co-author Mark Bulgutch. To lead us in this discussion, we welcome Craig Norris from CBC Kitchener-Waterloo. To share unforgettable Canadian books with people across Waterloo Region. We've had many great authors over the years, including Lawrence Hill, Terry Fallis, Louise Penny, and Richard Wagamies, along with many others. Over the history of One Book, One Community, the Waterloo Region Record has been one of the organization's greatest supporters. Jim Poling, editor of the Waterloo Regional Record, will now introduce our authors, Peter Mansbridge and Mark Bulgutch, and tonight's interviewer, Craig Norris.
Good evening. Thank you, Shannon. Pleased to be here. This is such an excellent and extraordinary event, and for the Waterloo Region Record to support it, it's you don't even have to ask every year. We're here. It's a literary event. It's about reading, it's about context, and it's about Canada. So the more we can explore and read what our authors in Canada are telling us, I think it's just great context for all Canadians. I'm also, before we begin, I just want to give a huge shout out to the organizers at One Book, One Community. I think you do just a fabulous job every year with your selections and in getting Canadians reading. I'm also particularly thrilled tonight to be introducing a conversation format with experts who are just expert conversationalists. I just think that's really cool, and I'm quite looking forward to the interview tonight. So I'll just, by way of introduction, I have some introductions for Peter and Mark that I'd like to read. Quite accomplished authors and journalists, and I just want to let people hear just some of the body of work. So as our audience would know, Peter Mansbridge is one of Canada's most respected journalists. He's a former chief correspondent for the CBC News, author of The National, our flagship nightly newscast, where Peter worked for 30 years reporting on national, international news stories, and also host of Mansbridge One-on-One. Peter's received over a dozen national awards for broadcast excellence, including Lifetime Achievement Award from the Academy of Canadian Cinema and Television. He's a distinguished fellow of the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto and former two-term chancellor at Mount Allison University. So if anybody wants to debate him, you know you're going in with somebody who can debate. In 2008, he was made an Officer of the Order of Canada, the country's highest civilian honor. And in 2012, he was awarded the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. He's also the author of the national bestseller and instant #1, I would add, of Extraordinary Canadians, and the national bestseller, Peter Mansbridge 101, Favorite Conversations and the Stories Behind them. Now, along with Peter, he'll be joined by Mark Bulgutch. And Mark is a journalist, an educator at Ryerson, a speaker and author of That's Why I'm a Journalist and That's Why I'm a Doctor. Mark worked for CBC for 40 years, 11 as senior editor of the National and another 10 as senior executive producer of all live news specials. He has taught at Ryerson University for almost 35 years. He's a regular contributor of opinion columns to the Toronto Star. He has won 14 Gemini Awards, 4 RTNDA Awards, and the Canadian Journalists Foundation Award of Excellence, and the Canadian Association of Broadcasters Gold Ribbon Award. So quite an accomplished and well-rounded journalist. Steering the conversation tonight is Waterloo Region's own Craig Norris. Craig has over a decade of broadcasting experience. Before coming to CBC, Craig worked at CTV starting in 2000, where he was a host on live current affairs TV program, The Chat Room. Some of you might remember. While there, he found time to work as a music reporter for eTalk. And in 2005, Craig moved over to CBC Radio, where, among other things, he hosted the Craig Norris Hour and CBC Radio 1's hit comedy show, Laugh Out Loud. He hosted and co-produced the critically acclaimed current affairs show, Know Your Rights, a field guide to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Craig joined CBC Kitchener-Waterloo Station as the host of the morning edition on Radio 1 89.1 FM, which I know we all listen to in the morning. So there's our panel of three. Thank you. I'm thrilled to be in company of such excellent journalists. And if there's ever a time the country needs broad reading, journalism, and support of our libraries, it's now. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Very true words. We need libraries. We need to know each other better. And that's what I'm hoping we're going to maybe achieve with all reading this book together. I want to introduce Mark Bulgutch and Peter Mansbridge now to join me on the screen. Now, normally, this would be happening somewhere in a beautiful room in Waterloo Region. We would all be sitting on the stage and we would be staring at the whites of each other's eyes. But this will do. I'm honored to be here with both of you. Now, full disclosure, Mark, you and I spoke about this on the show. We talked about the book. But I just do want to take you back here and the inspiration behind this. Where did it come from? Why did you want to do this?
Well, I mean, if you're asking me, you're asking the wrong guy. This came really from Peter on our, as well. I'll let Peter do it. I mean, why?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're going to do here is I think this is going to be organic as possible. No, so whoever wants to jump in, just jump in. If you got a song you want to do, we'll maybe later on. But
we'll try not to paralyze the audience with it. Let me first say, Craig, how excited we are to be a part of this event this evening. And thank you to Jim for the wonderful introduction. But most of all, thanks to the oboc community, really. We're truly honored to be involved in this year's 20th anniversary and for our book to be kind of the focus of the evening as you celebrate 20 years. How did this come about? Well, Simon & Schuster came to me a couple of years ago and said they really would like me to take on the idea of doing a book that focused, I think originally the idea was kind of hometown heroes, homegrown heroes, that kind of thing. And I was right in the middle of doing a couple of major international documentaries for the CBC at that point. And I said, look, I like this idea, but I'm going to need help because I'm going to be out of the country a fair amount in the next year, and I'd like to bring somebody along. And they said, well, we've got lots of people who can do that kind of work for you, kind of as a ghostwriters. And I said, no, I'm not interested in a ghostwriter. I'm interested in working with somebody, and I've got the perfect candidate. Mark and I have worked together for at least 30 years, more than that, I guess. And mainly, obviously, at the CBC, and doing all kinds of shows from the news to news specials. And one of the hidden qualities of Mark Bulgutch during that time, while he was producing and organizing things, was he was a spectacular writer, one of the greatest writers I've ever worked with. And he was also pretty fast, always as a writer. So I knew that this was something he'd be interested in. So I called him. He was interested. He'd already written a couple of books, as Jim mentioned earlier. And so the whole idea was to team up together, come up with a list of people who we felt weren't just homegrown heroes. They were extraordinary in terms of the things they'd done in their lives and how they'd inspired others by their actions and their meeting of challenges. And if you've read this book, you know that almost everybody here in this book had met a significant challenge in their life. So that's how it started. That was the inspiration behind it. And we worked together as we brought along. And I tell you, there was nobody more surprised than Mark and I when in the very first week it was on sale, it was a #1 bestseller. We were like, we couldn't believe that, but we took it and we run with it still to this day.
It is a wonderful book. And Mark, walk me through the process then. I mean, how did you decide someone stood out as extraordinary?
Well, Peter and I sat, I remember at the in the atrium at the CBC one day, now called the Peter Mansbridge Hall, I believe. And we were talking about the word hero, because as Peter said, the original thought was that we were doing stories about Canadian heroes. And neither of us really liked the word very much, hero, because we kept thinking, what's a hero? And I tell you, frankly, what came to my head as an image of a hero was a firefighter who races into a burning building, comes out with a baby, right? That's a hero, an obvious hero. And those stories are terrific stories, but we thought it would get, it would lose its impact pretty quickly if you told 15 stories about people who rescued babies in fires. And so we started moving toward the word extraordinary. And then we thought, okay, so what is extraordinary? Indeed, that became the challenge. And I think both of us were looking for people who weren't necessarily household names in Canada, because we thought there were plenty of people. I mean, I think Peter and I both had come across them in our journalism work, who did remarkable things, but didn't really make an impression or a lasting impression in everybody's head. Like they weren't, sports heroes, certainly, who you remember forever, like Rocket Richard. They are icons of Canadian heroism. And we thought, so we wanted people who weren't necessarily household names. And then we thought, well, those people exist. We had no doubt that these people were out there, people who contributed to the country. And that was another kind of criterion we wanted. We didn't just want somebody who had made it. We wanted somebody who had done something for the rest of us. So that was another criterion. And we needed people, we thought, who had a story to tell. I mean, it wasn't enough to be extraordinary. We needed people who had a story behind the story, if you will, that we could bring out, because we are storytellers, and we thought stories sell. That's the best way to get across what these people did, is if they have a story. So we didn't want somebody, you could be extraordinary because you're a billionaire. Well, because we don't have that many billionaires in Canada. So by definition, somebody who's a billionaire is extraordinary. But how many, and I have nothing against billionaires, but I don't know many of them to start. And, just making $1 billion so, that's only money. What did you do for us? What did you do that was extraordinary? And then we kind of batted back forth names of people who we'd either come across in our travels, or I'd read about, or Peter had read about, or that he had always wanted to talk to but never got to. Well, I'm sure we'll get to that. And so, it wasn't science, that's for sure, that gave us the list of people. It really was, our curiosity, our natural curiosity, when we read things about people who did something, and maybe we read it on page 72 of a newspaper, not on page 1. And that's where some of the best stories are always found, like a little deeper than just the surface. And it was that easy or hard. It was just, we thought this is what would make a good book, and then we just went out and found the people.
And I think the key to what Mark is saying there, Craig, is the story behind the story, in a way, that these people shared. Because, let's face it, there are 17 profiled in this book. That doesn't mean there are only 17 extraordinary Canadians in the country. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of extraordinary Canadians. But these 17 reflected great stories that helped tell the story that we wanted to tell with them. But they also came from different parts of the country. So we didn't want everybody sort of pocketed in central Ontario. We wanted a reflection of the country. And I think you see that in this book through the stories that we tell. But the key, as Mark said, is finding a story behind their extraordinary efforts to solve situations, solve personal crises, and in some cases their own. But that's what we were looking for.
And so, talk a bit about, Peter, about who was there people that you really sought out that you weren't able to talk to in all the time that you spent doing news? And I don't want you to pick, your favorite, because I realize that's impossible. But tell us about a couple of stories where you're like, I've got to talk to this person. I haven't had a chance to talk to this person. I have to talk to them.
Well, the most amazing thing about all of these people is none of them thought we should be talking to them. They were sort of, oh, no, I'm not extraordinary. There's nothing extraordinary about me. And we say, well, actually, we think there kind of is, and we want to know a little bit more about the background to what you've done, what you've accomplished. So some of these were kind of natural. I can tell you, nobody, on the one hand, they were all kind of shocked that we called them. On the other hand, none of them walked away from us. They were all willing to sit down and talk. In my case, because this was a lot of the work that went on in this was, after COVID started to have an impact. So in my case, when I phoned these people, because we were phoning as opposed to seeing them in person in almost all the cases, I'd say, hi, it's Peter Mansbridge. And I was wondering, we talked, and they said, yeah, sure, it's Peter. So that was one hurdle. But once we got through that, they were so engaging and so willing to talk about their situations that helped us. The idea was really Simon & Schuster's, but we had to be convinced that we should tell the stories in their voice as opposed to our voice. And one of the ways that was made easy was that they were so willing to talk about their situations, all of them. It took a little prodding, and we're both good at that. Mark's especially good at that. But once they started, it kind of tumbled out. Their stories tumbled out, and they were more fascinating and more extraordinary than we even thought at the beginning of the process.
It's such an inherently, we want to believe it's a Canadian thing where we have, the quiet pride, right? No one wants to talk about themselves. But there are stories out there, and these are amazing ones. Peter sort of sidestepped my question, Mark, so I'll ask you.
Why don't I prod him? Why don't you tell the story of JTF2? That's just to let people know, it is extraordinarily difficult to deal with JTF2, which is Canada's Special Forces Unit. I know I can give some background before I give it over to Peter. when I was still at CBC. I mean, I must have tried for 25 years to do a report, a special on our special forces. I think all Canadians know about the Navy SEALs in the United States, about Green Berets in the United States, about the special forces in Great Britain. Nobody knows JTF2. I mean, if you went on the street in Waterloo, I suspect, and said, "What's JTF2?" they might think it's a robot in a Star Wars movie. We just don't kind of wave our flags. And every time in my experience, I talked to the chief of the defense staff about, let me have access to our special forces. Let Canadians know that, we don't take a back seat to the Navy SEALs or the Army Rangers. We have them too. Let us show Canadians about them. And, they would be very hesitant and said no most of the time. And I tell you, I had them finally in September of 2001. They were about to agree. They had agreed that they would let us shoot pictures of them in training and do a little special on them. And then what happened was September 11th, 2001 came, and suddenly, A, they got busy, and two, they went away. So now here we are 20 years later, and now I can tell Peter, go ahead, you tell them how you got a JTF2 guy.
Well, the process was very similar for literally decades. I'd been trying, as well as Mark had been trying, to get access to this, super secret commando unit. I'd even tried, I'd gone to the top. I'd gone to a certain prime minister of the day and said, look, there's a story here with these guys, and I want to tell it, and you've got to let me get access to them. And he said, give me a couple of days, and I'll see what I can arrange. And a couple of days later, he phoned me. I was at home. He phoned me. The prime minister phoned me at home, and he said, look, I can't get it. I can't get the access. He says, in fact, if I told you the truth, I don't even know what they do, beyond the general broad strokes. I don't get briefed on particular operations that they do. And so I don't know what happens, which only made me want more to be able to break through. So long story short, I finally, brokered a deal with JTF2 under the condition that I never reveal the name of the one particular commando. I met about a dozen of them, and I picked one who I felt had the best story, and that's the story you're here. I could never reveal his real name, so it's a pseudonym that we use of Levon Johnson. But he tells a gripping story that I think most Canadians are totally unaware of, what that unit does and did and still does. They were in Afghanistan a lot, but that's not the only place they've been in the country, in the world. They go to a lot of hotspots. There's no publicity surrounding it. You never hear about it. There's no TV news items on it. And they're in extremely dangerous situations. And that profile of Levon Johnson gives you a sense of the kind of things they do. So here was a guy who, faced a particular challenge, and, he's very blunt about not only what he did, but his feelings through it all, and his feelings today. He's still in there. He's still in JTF2. But he knows that his time is almost done.
Wow. It is, that is an incredible story in the book. Mark, what about you? Do you have one that leaps out at you that you can?
Well, I mean, as you said, you're asking me to choose between.
Of course,
but
I have to, Mark. I have to try.
Yeah. Well, I won't. Well, I can pick. Everyone's a winner, so I'll pick one.
Don't make me call the prime minister.
No, I didn't do that. The one that I was, the original framing of your question was there somebody you always wanted to talk
right?
to?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was. I mean, I produced Remembrance Day coverage for CBC and for all the networks, actually, as the pool producer. for 15 years. So for 15 years, I went to Ottawa I went on November 10th, and on November 11th, we had the ceremony. And inevitably, the highlight of the ceremony was the benediction by the honorary chaplain. His name was Rabbi Reuven Bulka. And even though we were both at the National War Memorial, I never met him. I never actually came face to face with him, because the guy would arrive around 7 o'clock on November 11th. And by about 9 o'clock, I was in our production truck getting ready. And he would arrive around 9:30. So I never actually saw him or met him. But inevitably, at the end of the program, when, with those of us in the truck and the anchors and our analysts, we would say, that was a really good program. Way to go. But what was the best part of it? The best part was always Rabbi Bulka, because he just caught the spirit of the day, we all thought. But I never met him. So when the book came, I thought, okay, this is it, right? I'm going to call Rabbi Bulka and say we want maybe do this. I mean, it was a little awkward to say, maybe we want you in the book. Do you have a story to tell? But I thought, well, let's find out. And I called him, and first thing, he was a great guy. I mean, he really had a great sense of humor about it all. And we started talking about whether we would be in the book. We didn't start an interview, obviously. And the first thing I found out about him was that he was born on June 6, 1944. So, he was born on D-Day, on the D-Day, not June 6th, some other year. He was born on D-Day. So what an interesting, in the news business, you look for a little hook. What a great hook, made to measure hook of a natural affinity to things military, even though obviously he never was a military guy. He was a rabbi. And so we started talking, and he did have a great story. He had relatives who had survived. Well, he had relatives who were killed in the Holocaust. He had survivors, relatives. His father was a rabbi. He lived in England. He was born in England. He came to the United States, and then he became a rabbi in Canada, in Ottawa. And he had a great story about how he became to Ottawa and what he thought about Canada and how he, adopted this as his country. So his story was terrific. And there was a guy I really, really did want to meet after all these years. And and as Peter said, because he was in Ottawa, I did most of it by Zoom, but I had the opportunity to actually meet him because he came to Toronto, where I live. He had a little engagement here, and I said, I'd love to meet you. And so I ran over, and we, saw each other, and it was great. And, the sad ending to this story, unfortunately, the rabbi died this summer, just a few weeks ago. Really, I think he was 76 when he died. Well, somebody can figure it out. He was, 1944. He was a great guy. And, he became, out of nowhere, he had cancer, and very serious, obviously. He was stage 4 before they found it. And, he passed away a few weeks ago. But, there's the story of a man who came to Canada from England via the United States and made Canada his home and loved being a Canadian. I mean, he has the Order of Canada. It's a good story, So there's, one of my favorites.
It's Peter mentioned at the top. I mean, I'm thinking back to, there are, if I were to put them in that arc that we learned in English class, there are challenges of different kinds in almost maybe every one of these stories.
Oh yeah.
And that's an inherent part of this, correct? Is meeting these challenges.
Absolutely. That's what drew us to a lot of these people, because of the way they dealt with the challenges, either in their adult life or in some cases in their childhood. The first story in the book is about Cindy Blackstock, who, as Mark said, most people in this book you'll have never heard of. And that's in some ways what makes their role in our lives so extraordinary. But Cindy Blackstock is somebody you may have heard of. You've probably almost certainly seen her. She's an activist on Indigenous affairs, especially as they relate to children and the inequality for many Indigenous kids, through school and health care and a variety of other different things. But I had met Cindy Blackstock once during one of the issues that she was fighting for. And I thought, what is it about this woman? I'd love to hear her story. And so, I reached out to her and talked to her for a long time on the telephone. And I suddenly realized, and this goes back to Mark's point about trying to find a story, the kind of the hook to tell the story of this particular person, whoever it might be in the 17 we profiled. Well, the thing that struck me right away about Cindy, she grew up in BC, and she had a Indigenous father and a non-Indigenous mother. And she quickly realized in her childhood the inequality factor that has dominated her work ever since. She quickly realized it because she saw that when she was out just with her mother, her non-Indigenous mother, they'd go into a restaurant or go into a store, and everything was like perfectly normal. She was treated just like everybody else. If she went out with just her father, it was a totally different situation. Suddenly, she wasn't just like everybody else. Life was very different for her when she was only with her father. And that had an impact on her from the earliest time, 3, 4, 5 years old. And she's lived with that ever since, and now she's trying to do her best to break down those barriers that still exist in the way society generally looks at Indigenous Canadians, and especially Indigenous kids, and the unfairness of the systems, where they be education, whether they be health services. She's been trying to break those down, and she's been very successful at it, and she's a great ambassador for that issue. Anyway, her story, which is a lot more complicated than just those elements I've told you, is one of those areas that further underlines what Mark was saying. Is you find a story that can then take you on a thread, a line through their lives, and the impact that they're having on all of us.
How much time did it take? I mean, to flesh these out. I mean, I guess some of them must have, opened up faster than others. But how was there time to get in there and dig around? That's a nice reaction, Mark. How much time was there to get in there? And like the rabbi story, I mean, you knew him in passing, right? And you'd interacted with him, but you got a great story.
Yeah, I mean, time is a luxury that often in daily news we don't have. First, we're in a hurry to get it, and then we have to compress it into 1:45, 2 minutes. So this was a luxury to have the time. I mean, we work differently. I mean, Peter worked his, I worked mine. So I can only speak in my case. I would have a first. I mean, you can't talk for too long in one sitting, or they get tired. You get tired of listening, and sometimes, and it's trying to give you a life story. It wasn't like we needed to do it in 20 minutes. Just do it. You don't have to. We can compress it later when we get into the book, but. So I would say the first one usually was an hour and a half, then another hour and a half, unless the person was, really pressed in some ways. Because I know that in one case, I did somebody in 3.5 hour sitting, and then a couple of more later to kind of fill in some gaps, because there's always gaps. You would know as an interviewer, you say, gee, I wish I had asked that. Yeah. Well, in this case, I did have the chance to go back and say, what an idiot I was. Why didn't I ask that? So I went back and asked that. Because you can kind of see when you see a transcript, right? I mean, you're doing live radio. You may not even have time to reflect on what you did. But in this case, I once did the interview, then you get a transcript, make a transcript. Nobody helped. And you read it and you say, oh my goodness gracious, why didn't I ask that question? And so I either do a quick email and say, can I talk to you tomorrow or something like that? Or I pick up the phone and say, I forgot to ask. And so we'd get to ask again. So it takes time to fill in every gap. And then we had an editor at Simon & Schuster who, is, Miss Eagle Eye, and has, she has, I think I put in my little introduction to her in the book, she has a remarkable ability as a diplomat to tell you, this is great, it's fabulous. And then she lists 73 things that are wrong with it. So it was, and so she would kind of prompt you to fill in the gap, or go back and ask this question and go back and give more color. Like there's a story, Pat Danforth, who was seriously injured, disabled in a car accident. And she said, so what kind of car was it? What was the make of the car? What color was it? It would never even occur. I mean, she's obviously more used to writing books than I am. I'm used to the camera will tell you what kind of car it is.
Right.
I don't have to worry about that. And so she was good at that, right? She would just kind of say, you could add something here. She was big on scenes, right? Don't just tell us it happened. Really go into it. Well, how did he feel when that happened? And, and in some cases, I think she recognized, and certainly I did. I mean, going back to Rabbi Bulka, I mean, she said, how did he feel at some moment happened? And he told me, Mark, that was 60 years ago. I can make up how I felt, but I don't remember how I felt. And I said, no, we don't want to make things up. So, that's how it went for me. Peter may have different experience.
Peter, was your process the same as that?
Yeah, pretty much the same. And some of the subjects that I was dealing with, I mean, were challenging to get hold of at certain times. I think of Nadine Caron, who's a surgeon in Prince George, British Columbia, and she's a very busy surgeon. And so, we'd agree to a certain time to interview him with the time zone differences and everything between here and BC. And then, 15 minutes beforehand, she'd send me a text and say, can't do it. I've just been called into surgery. So those kind of things would get in the way or would limit the amount of time we could talk at any one time. But listen, there was a real luxury for both Mark and I in this. We were used to, daily news. That was our lifeblood for decades. And you've got to get things like right away. You've got to get the information. You got to break it down. You've got to vet it. You've got to analyze it. You got to report, and it's all coming up in the next hour or two. Here we had the luxury of, we had a deadline, but it was months away. It wasn't minutes away. So that gave us the opportunity to review stuff, to look at transcripts and say, okay, this is missing or that's missing, and I've got to go back to it. Because remember, we were also writing in their voice, which, we were, I think, both a little worried about that at the beginning when the idea first came along from Sarah St. Pierre, who was the editor that Mark was talking about. When she first said that to us, we thought, oh man, we've never done that. That's not what we do. But actually, when we started doing it, not only was it fun, it was, in some ways, it was easier because we had their words, we had their voice through those transcripts. Now, we had to move things around, obviously, and it wasn't just simply a matter of slipping the transcript into the book. We had to create the story, but using their words, and there was that actually did, in some ways, make it easier.
It was, and you bring up a very important point in this book, in that they do appear to be written in the first person, right? And the narrative is there in a first person way.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to let everyone know, I see your comments on the side. There's some good questions coming in, and we'll get to those from some people who are watching tonight. We will get to, I have a couple more questions I want to ask, and then we'll maybe head over to some of the people, the audience questions. Were there people who were right on the edge of getting into this book, but they didn't? And I guess that is a ham-fisted way of asking, is there a sequel to Extraordinary Canadians? Like, there had to be people that, and I hope maybe no, that's it, Craig. That's it. Were there people that
only 17 in the country? Yeah, there are no more.
People have to have more kids, and then we'll wait a few years, and then. But really, like
I think you could do an annual Extraordinary Canadians. But this was a particular moment, as it turned out. Part of the reason, and I think we can admit it, that this book was so successful when it came out, almost a year ago now, it came out last November, was that we were in the middle of a pandemic. And people weren't just in their homes. They were looking for inspiration. They were looking for, how am I going to get through this? This book is a story of a lot of people who got through very, very difficult situations, arguably much more difficult than, being locked down in your home because of a pandemic. And so people went to the book for inspiration. They saw what these people had accomplished with some very difficult situations around them. Whether it was a car crash, or whether it was a terrible disease, or whether it was growing up in the midst of a difficult case of systemic racism. There was there were stories of people who had reached that challenge, and they were inspiring to read. And I think that added, and still does to this day, as we know, a reason to read these stories, to be inspired by these stories, and to rise up and meet challenges yourself.
So, Mark, that's a great point. I mean, at the stage we're in, I mean, we're not through this pandemic yet. I mean, that adds a resonance to this book for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it did come out. I mean, look, we were at first worried a little bit, I guess, that people have bigger things to do on their on their minds than read a book about Canadians who are extraordinary. And bookstores were mostly closed, so it wasn't that easy to go out and buy a book. Even libraries were closed. You had to, you could still maybe get a book out of the library if you went and got, well, you would know as well as I know how books in libraries were doing at that time. So there certainly were obstacles. And maybe we became a #1 national bestseller because we sold 10 books and everybody else sold 9. That's not true. It was just, we were, that was one of the issues for us. I mean, for the publisher, really, we just wrote a book and they have to market it. But it obviously did strike a chord with people, and not to be too silly about things. I mean, Peter's name is on the cover. He's not an unknown Canadian. I'm quite sure if this had been a solo effort by me, it would not be a national bestseller. So there's some of that going on here. I mean,
hold on here. Your name's on.
Yeah,
your
it's
name's
there.
right there too.
Well, the 7 people in my family added to the total. Excellent. But I didn't anchor the national. I'm the guy behind the scenes, and books by people behind the scenes. That's not why we're here. But I would just say, it did catch the mood of the country. It really did, because I think people were looking for uplifting. I think they had enough kind of misery and sadness in their real day-to-day lives. They were missing friends. They were missing family. And here was a way to connect to people around us. I mean, I think part of the extraordinary and part of the gift of the book, if you will, is that I think it tells us that there are giants who walk among us, and we don't know it. That this country, which is not a great flag-waving country, this is not the United States, right?
Right.
Where you can drive down any country road in the United States, and there are American flags everywhere. They wave that. They have no trouble with waving the flag. That a football game there is like a religious experience of Americana. We don't have that, and though this book isn't going to fill that gap, it at least quietly tells people in the Canadian way that we don't have to take a back seat to that giant to the south. I mean, we are swamped every day with American culture and American mythology, that they are the gift to the world. They are the exceptional country. I'm not anti-American. They are all that. They are an exceptional country. They are a huge country. They are a remarkable country, but they don't have, they're not exclusive to all that. We have that. We just don't bang our drum very often. And none of these people, as Peter said, nobody called us when they heard that we were writing a book about extraordinary Canadians and, applied, can I be an extraordinary Canadian? That didn't happen. Just the opposite. So the people we talked to, as Peter says, they were like astounded that we wanted them, that they just thought they were going about their business, being whatever they were being. And they were extraordinary, and that's the magic of Canadians, right? We don't even know what we have. Sometimes that's to our detriment. And if we can show other Canadians that we are a country from coast to coast, as Peter said, we found people in Newfoundland, we found people in British Columbia, and every point in between. We are a great country, and we should once in a while bang the drum. So here's a little banging of the drum, and it's a little drum. It's not a big timpani drum. The Americans might drum. Maybe we have a little snare drum or something. But that's us, right? And the people in the book, they're not out there, getting agents to negotiate with us for a price to pay for their stories. None of that was happening. It was just these people who go about their lives doing good things for the rest of us. And isn't it nice that we can tell Canadians that?
We did give them a free book, though.
We did.
Well,
we did.
It all comes out in the wash. They snare drums are small, but they cut through.
Yeah.
And I look at it as well. As I was reading it, I was thinking, and it goes to what both you, Mark, and Peter said, and that is, these people we don't like. Cindy Blackstock I knew, and there are a few other names in here that I knew, but it also might give people pause to think about people that they're dealing with in their everyday lives, right? That they come across and be like, you have maybe gone through things that I don't know about. I mean, and I think that's part of the gift of this book as well, if I may say so.
Yeah, I think you've got something there, because everybody has a certain degree of extraordinary in them and in their life story. These people have a large degree of extraordinary in them, but I think you don't know anything about that person who you may be, crossing on the sidewalk or sitting next to on an airplane or on a bus or what have you. It's worth keeping that in mind. And I think this book reminds you of that there is extraordinary in a lot of us. It's just degrees of extraordinary, I guess.
And I think a lot of us have challenges that other people don't know about, right? I mean, all these people in this book, they go shopping, some of them have to buy shoes for their kids for back to school. I mean, they do the same things everyone else does as well.
Yeah, I would say, let me, one of the things I think the book kind of, if you stop to reflect, I mean, if you just read it, okay, great. Now I've had some time to kind of reflect on who's in the book. And many of them, and you have to go beyond the surface, is what I would say. Rob Nash, who was a musician, and I tell you honestly, when I looked at his bio and I looked at some pictures of him online before I called, and like I was a little reluctant because here's a guy, he dresses in a lot of leather, he has spiked hair. I have none, but he has spiked hair, and I'm a guy whose musical preferences are kind of Perry Como, maybe as far as the Beatles is Wild. That's about it, right? And he is a hard rocker. And I thought, like, this isn't going to work. How am I going to talk to this guy? Like, it's not going to work. But, he seemed to have an interesting story. So I call him up. And what do I find? I find this guy is a soft-spoken, quiet guy who is almost shy about everything. And we got along very well. Like I would never have spoken to him. Like if he was beside me in an airplane, I would have gone, "Oh my God, like does he have to sit here?" Like he's not my cup of tea under normal circumstances. So it's important to get beyond that. I mean, Pat Danforth, who is a person who has devoted her life to fighting for the disabled, and I should say not for special rights, but for equal rights. And so here, if you came across her, she's a woman in a wheelchair. Well, how do you normally react to when we see somebody in a wheelchair? Do we feel sorry for them? Do we kind of avoid them? Do we, they have their own life, you kind of, whatever. But, to get to her story, get beyond the wheelchair is important. And there is somebody in a wheelchair, you might think, oh boy, she must have a tough life and who knows. But there, she doesn't feel sorry for herself. She goes out there and she, fights for the rights of people like her who just want to live normal lives. It's not her fault that she's in a wheelchair, that she had a terrible car accident. None of it's her fault. And so why does she have to stop living a life as close to normal as possible? And so it's just important to get beyond the surface when you see people. And that's the lesson I took away from dealing with these folks.
Yeah. What is it? We're going to get to some of the viewer questions here, but what does it mean to know that now there are going to be hundreds of people reading this book at the same time in Waterloo Region? What does it mean to you both? It's a big book club. That's what's going on here.
Yeah. Right. Well, I mean, I think it's a remarkable thing. I've talked to people about, with friends when I hear, somebody has read the book, and I think, okay, I know my reading habits. I'm a voracious reader. Okay, so what does that mean? It means I read like 3 books a month. I mean, how many books can a person read? There's time, right? There are demands on our time. And if, I figure if you're a solid reader, I mean, I remember when I was younger, right? When I had to deal with my kids and my job and all that, the only time I really got to read was on the subway going down to work. That was it, right? I on the way home, I was reading the newspaper already. At work, I read the newspaper and other things. But when I wasn't at work on the weekends, I had a family. I had time commitments. Reading was a luxury I had on the subway. So an hour a day, really. It's all I could read other than for work. And I assume that's what normal Canadians have in their head. So if they can read 12 books a year, 1 a month, right? That's it. Of all the books in the world, there are, thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of books to choose from. Every year there are new ones, and go back in time. How many books are there? And if a person can only read 12 books a year, and if they've chosen to read one that I had a hand in writing, well, how can you not feel great about that? Like that's how I feel about it. If you're going to read my book, that's quite a tribute, I think.
Peter?
Like I love the fact that people congregate through book clubs, and that they're doing it through this difficult time with the pandemics that's going on, and doing it through Zoom calls. I've done a number of book clubs in the past year in different parts of the country through this vehicle, and I'm always, I'm excited by the fact that there are people who, like Mark says, no matter how many books a year they read or books a month they read, that they are reading, that they are taking that time, that they're afforded that time, either away from their normal family life, from television, from radio, from what have you, to just sit and read and use their imagination. I mean, this book, like so many books, calls on you to imagine the scenes that are being discussed, and some of them are, are graphic in the sense that they're powerful. They're powerful images, and so the people are sitting there reading them, and in our case, reading the words we wrote, even though in so many cases where they're in the voice of the other person, but we did put this book together. That feels pretty good. It feels like you've contributed something worthwhile to a community like Kitchener-Waterloo, Cambridge, just down the road from Stratford,
Ontario. Yes.
Yeah, I'm in Toronto tonight because I've got a few things I have to do about my next book. But nevertheless, I just think it's a great thing, and oboc is a wonderful annual experience, but it's born out of a club that takes its reading seriously, and has for, well, obviously at least 20 years. So good for them.
I should mention, my wife can't watch this tonight because she's at her book club.
Yeah, and my wife has is involved in a book club as well, and I'm not, but Mark and I are frequent guests at book clubs.
That's what I mean. You're too busy writing books. You don't have time to be in book clubs. You got plenty of books you got to left to write. What I will say for people watching, and we will right after this, we'll get to this and something else. I will say that I read it front to back when I was going to speak with Mark about it. And then I went back and I sort of read it more as like a reference style. Like I didn't read it sequentially. I just remembered a story. I go, I'm going to go back and I'm going to revisit this story. And because that I found, and it's beautiful that for that as well.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
You don't have to read it sequentially at all.
Yeah.
You start at the back and read backwards through the chapters, or pick it up and read one in the middle. It really is that kind of book. Yeah,
for me, it was a story that resonated, like the JTF story, and I went back and I reread it, and I'm like, oh man, yes, and so yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily a book that you have to read, front to back. Just before we get to the questions, and are you gentlemen both okay to take some questions from viewers? Okay, because I can't answer them. I mean, I could. Be a lot of this. I don't know. As we all go into this, as we all begin to read this as a community, what do you think you want people to think about as they're cracking this book open?
Well, I think as he usually does, Mark kind of caught it. I mean, this is a book about us. It's a book about Canadians. It's a book about who we are and some of the challenges we've met. I mean, there's a broad sweep of issues that come up in this book. These people are similar in the sense that they've met challenges, but they're very unlike each other through their life experience, most of which has been in this country. And so those experiences tell us about us. but these are all, extraordinary people because they have been faced with big challenges, very different challenges. But they've faced them. And in some cases, they resisted dealing with them initially. They kind of given up in their space. And then something grabbed onto each one of them. And they said, no, I'm going to deal with this. I'm going to face it. And I'm going to make it different, not just for me, but for others. Like the story that Mark tells about Rob Nash, the impact he's had on others is quite remarkable. So, I think you can't help but have a takeaway of this book that says something to you about the country in which we live and the truly remarkable, extraordinary people who share this space with us.
Yeah, I think there are there's no secret. Peter and I have had the privilege of traveling as part of our CBC work, and traveling the world, and being Canadians overseas is remarkable. And I think sometimes you never feel more Canadian than when you're not in Canada. And we've been to countries that admire Canadians. I mean, we've been on the D-Day beaches where they revere Canadians. We've been to Holland where they revere Canadians because Canadians liberated them, not us, Canadian soldiers who were too young, liberated them in the Second World War, and they love Canadians. So we have always had the privilege of kind of seeing how others see Canadians that we don't even see ourselves. And it's just a chance to see ourselves. It's also a chance, I think, and after an election is a good time to mention this, in a country that has regions and seems to always be having these fights between regions. What I have found every time I travel the country is that we're all actually Canadians in the end. We hear things about maybe a region where we don't live, but if you go there, they're just like us. They're not yahoos. They're not this. They're not that. They're us. And so here is a book, with people from Alberta. There's people from Manitoba. There's people from Newfoundland. There's people from PEI, people from Ontario, Quebec, and they're all Canadian. So they are us. And we, sometimes we get carried away perhaps with this regionalism. Well, we don't have to. We are in the same boat, and maybe if we row in the same direction, we'll end up with a lot more extraordinary people.
Right. And forgive me just for waxing, sort of remembering this. It takes me back. And I don't know, Peter, if it was in 2019 or was it the 2015 election where you went across Canada and you spoke to people, and it was a whole special. And that's what I came away with. That was, well, everyone seems to be afraid of the same things, and they're concerned about the same things. Yeah. I'm going to throw it over to some questions now from viewers, and there's some really good ones up here. Going to start with, this might be the most controversial question, so we're going to throw this out there. It's from Elizabeth Kernahan. She asks, what is Mark drinking? we are guessing beer.
You're guessing wrong. It is Diet Coke, which is about the strongest thing I ever drink. So
okay,
that's me.
Okay.
Water.
Yeah. Mine is my famous, because it's the time of year, it's my pumpkin hooch that I make in the shed. So we're going to start off. David Waltner Taves asks, and you did touch on this about speaking to diverse people, but he said, you are two older white guys. How did you break out of that stereotype to find diverse people? And did you get any pushback on this? Whoever would like to jump in on these.
No, I mean, we certainly didn't get any pushback. Not all older white guys resist the desire to reflect diversity, whether that's gender, region, race, creed, you name it. And there's a sense of all those different issues surrounding diversity. I mean, one of my passions has been, since I started in this business in northern Manitoba in the 1960s, was issues surrounding Indigenous Canadians. And there are at least 2 stories in here of the 17 that involve Indigenous Canadians and some of the challenges that they face because they are Indigenous. So listen, we didn't meet any resistance or any pressure on that front. We came up with our list of those who we wanted to focus on, and nobody challenged us on that. I mean, I will say this, that there were 16 on the list when we began, because we began it's hard to believe that there used to be a time before the pandemic, but there was, and that's when we started this book. But as we got into the pandemic, we both felt we've got to somehow reflect that. This is a part of Canada today, and this book is going to come out in the middle of this pandemic. Remember, this book came out before we had vaccines, and so it was still such an overwhelming part of our lives. Still is today, but certainly was a year ago, and so we ended up focusing on Moses Lee, who's a nurse in Vancouver, and he has a very dominant role on the front lines of the healthcare system, dealing with COVID patients. So he and his wife, both of whom have been very involved on this front. So that's why it became 17 as opposed to 16. So diverse in a lot of different ways, not just ones we normally speak of.
Right.
But we tried to touch on all those.
Yeah, I might say, I think one of the interesting things that we found out by looking only after the book came out, we looked at it and we realized that 5 of the 17 were not born in Canada. They're Canadians, but they weren't born here. Now, we didn't start out to look for new Canadians, and some of them aren't new Canadians. They've been here most of their lives. But, if there's a message, there isn't a message there. I mean, it's, in a country that needs immigrants, that is multicultural, even sometimes without trying, you find this, right? This is the mosaic that you find in this country. If you look for people who are extraordinary, you won't find a bunch of old white guys necessarily. You'll find Canada. It's not that hard. It really isn't. I mean, why should it be hard? It's not like we are 90% white country anymore. We're not that. And I think both Peter and I are wise enough to know that fact, that this country has changed dramatically since we were young, and we should reflect that.
Mm-hmm. M.A. Lenio, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, but actually quotes Moses Lee from the book and says, but what I hope stays the same is the camaraderie and the surge of community support that's going to be even more important at the other end of this. And she wonders, has it? I mean, what would Moses think now of where we are, do you think? Yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that.
Well, I think all those who are on the front lines of this, have met different challenges, including some of their own decision making. And the story's not written yet on that. I mean, and we didn't try to write it on the Moses front in terms of the story being over, because it wasn't then, it isn't now. And the whole way, I mean, BC's been having its problems of late, and Bonnie Henry, who's received accolades from around the world for her work in BC as the chief medical health officer, has been having a tough time of late defending some of her actions. She's strong, a strong person, and she can handle things herself. But nobody has been perfect on this. That's for sure. And it's going to live with us for a long, long time to come. We may beat the virus. We haven't beaten the impact of it, and that impact will be around and condition us for years to come.
Yeah, and not to speak for Moses, obviously, but I think when we spoke with him, as Peter says, the vaccine wasn't even on the horizon. Right. We all knew that the best case for a vaccine in the past was 4 years.
Yeah.
So I think if Moses were here, what would disappoint him in this, as you were speaking of, hope we all have this togetherness that we're trying to pull through, and we have people refusing to be vaccinated. That I think would be quite shocking to him. I think back then, when we were all kind of literally dying for a vaccine, the thought that some people, and not just a real slim part of the population, like 2%, 3%, might say no thanks, to see the numbers that are still resisting it, it says something. And because I think our frontline healthcare workers, I think we all know, are exhausted. Mm-hmm. It's a tough thing to every day have ICUs completely full every day, to have to turn away heart patients, cancer patients. As Peter says, we're not through it, and there will be a reckoning. At some point, we hope we will get back to what seems like normal, and somebody will write the history of all this and figure out what we did right, what we did wrong. Why are there vaccine hesitant? Why are there vaccine resistant people who just won't listen to what the rest of us think is a reasonable thing to do? Somebody will have to really sit down when it's all over. It's hard to kind of figure out a hurricane when you're in the middle of it.
Maybe that's Peter's next book. It's a few quick questions. How did you choose the order in which the stories appear? Judy Ginsler asked that question. Was it your editor?
It was the editor. I mean, as you said earlier, Craig, you could put these in any order you want. One doesn't lead to the next. But Sarah came up with the order, and I don't think I didn't challenge her thoughts on that, and I don't think you did either, Mark. Right?
I thought she must know what she's doing.
Yeah, exactly.
And as you say, Craig, people can read chapter 12, read chapter 16, read chapter 4, take a pick. If you happen to be interested in medical things, you might read that. If you're interested in disabled rights, you read that. If you're in Indigenous rights, you read that. So.
Elizabeth Kernahan, who asked about what turned out to be Diet Coke, said, "Hi there, we're a book club that has been together for 24 years. We are the Novel Escape, and our question is, did the subjects of the stories read and approve the story before it was published? And did anyone ask any part to be removed?"
Well, I'll speak for the ones that I dealt with first, and then Mark came. Because we were writing in the first person, we didn't want any of them to say, "Wait a minute, that's not what I felt. Mm-hmm. Why am I reading this?" And it says that I'm saying this. So what I did when I was finished, I read them back to the subjects that I dealt with, and nobody said, "Oh no, you got to take that out." I mean, there were discussions about names and references that way, but nothing in terms of, "Oh no, I wish you hadn't said that," or I didn't mean that," or what have you. That didn't come up.
Yeah. So yes, everybody read what I had written, because even though it's in their voice, it's not a transcript. things, nobody tells a story from A to B to C. People tell stories A, J, L, P, and so we had to make the narrative out of it. That's what we do. That's what we do anyway. So, we took all the information, and there were times where I misunderstood what they said. I would get a timeline wrong, perhaps. Like this happened before this. I thought it happened after that. Sometimes I would make what I thought was a logical leap, and I was wrong. So yes, as Peter says, it's in their first person, so it couldn't be wrong. And it's not a journalistic enterprise. I mean, people understand. Peter and I, we would never show, like, if Peter did an interview, obviously for CBC, and recorded it and then played it back later. People would never have the right to edit that interview. This was not a journalistic experience. This was a book, and we needed their cooperation. And so, yes, and we wanted to make sure it was 100% right, because it's not a transcript. I mean, with an interview on television, clearly they are speaking these words, so it's hard to get them wrong. But here it was easy to get them. It could be easy to get them wrong, and so yeah, I was certainly corrected from time to time, but nobody ever said, no, I don't want that dirty laundry, and that wasn't there.
Just a couple more questions, if you will, gentlemen. There's sort of related ones. Susan asked, how many did you interview, and how did you decide on the final 17? And then there was another one who said, you must have had a long list of people you wanted to talk to. How did you narrow it down?
Actually, there weren't more than 17 that we decided on. In fact, we were having to keep arguing for, like, more room. And then when we added Moses Lee, there was, are you going to drop one to put Moses in? No, we're not going to do that. We want 17 now. So, that was the process. But there weren't like 25 and, okay, these eight aren't extraordinary enough. That didn't happen.
Huh. And you said off the top, I believe, that no one turned you down, correct? Or did some people turn you?
No, I don't recall anybody turning us down. Mark, did you?
No. There were names on our long list when our first conversation Peter and I had. Yeah. I came with a bunch of names. Peter came with a bunch of names, and then we said, well, he might be good, she might be okay, but we kind of tried to hit our first 17. And as I said, we wanted to make sure they had a story. That was the only thing. And I remember asking Peter, isn't it going to be a little awkward to call up somebody and say, we're thinking of putting you in a book, and then tell them, oh, no, not good enough. How do you do that? Yeah. I was a little concerned about that, but he said, no, you tell him you're kind of working on things. Maybe it's not the right fit. And Peter's a much smoother operator than I am, you understand. So, but it never really, it was remarkably easy that way, I must say.
Well, Mark, that's because on the national, you probably had to call up guests and tell people you were going in a different direction.
I had people do that.
Keep in mind before we picked up the phone and called these people, we knew a fair amount about them, right? So we were already pretty sure that this is the direction we wanted to go with this person. And what we ended up being was pleasantly surprised that there was so much more to their individual stories than we knew, and that we'd already, researched and found out, and which just made it that much more, engaging and easy to have them in the book.
Yeah, Gina Cody is a good example. I'll just very quickly. I remembered her. I talked earlier about how I might have seen something on page 47 of a newspaper. I remember Gina Cody. I saw a very small newspaper item one day that said she had donated some money to Concordia University in Montreal, and they had named the engineering faculty after her. And that was years ago. I kind of just had that in the back of my mind. And when the book came up, I thought, here is a woman who was an engineer in the late 70s in Canada in an engineering school. And I went to school in the early 70s, and I remember what engineering was like. All male, in some ways crudely male. And I thought, there's a woman who did it, right? Becomes the first PhD in engineering in Concordia. Obviously has a successful enough career to donate enough money that they would name a building and a faculty after her. So there was so that's all I knew about her, really. And I thought she must have a good story. Did I know she had a good story? I didn't know it, but I thought she would. And so, called her up. We talked for a little bit, and then I fleshed out the story, as Peter said. We kind of had I thought we had a good story there. And how could it not be a good story? And that's how it came about.
Just briefly, this is a great question from Charlene Ball to Mark. What you just described is a great story, but then how do you come across a guy like Rob Nash with his leather and his spiked hair?
Indeed.
Because we know he wasn't sitting beside you on a bus because you would have moved.
Move seats, yeah. I was looking at a website of people who had the Order of Manitoba, and he was one of them. And I'm not sure there was a picture there. All I knew, and so I saw he had won the Order of Manitoba for his work with suicide prevention among teenagers. And so that struck me as interesting. I didn't know a lot about him, but again, that sounds like a good story. I didn't know everything about his car crash and his brain injury. I didn't know all that, but I eventually did come across a picture of him, and I thought, ugh. But the story still resonated with me, so I went for it. You gotta expand.
I just love the honesty of that. Long story short, he's my son-in-law, Craig. This is an interesting thing too. Did you have any? And I'm going to get to Olwen Sigsworth, his question or their question in a second. There are a variety of ages represented in this book, so I can say that because that's the first part of his question. Are there a variety of ages represented, and did you include those who you thought would appeal to your readership? So, I mean, a back doorway to that is: did you have any sense of who the demographic would be for this book? That's a telling face, Mark. Yeah, no,
I don't think so. We wanted to make the book interesting for any reader by telling stories of extraordinary people and what age they were. That never really entered the discussion. Regions, gender, backgrounds, in terms of kind of where they came from. Did make a difference for us, but I don't recall age ever being a factor in that.
No, I think again, we have a background as public broadcasters, right? We don't care about ratings. We just care about telling the stories we think we should tell, and that's the career Peter had. That's the career I had. You're now at CBC. We were kind of brought up in that culture of story first, and we think audiences are naturally attracted to good stories and important stories, and so we've not had a career of trying to figure out will they like it. We just don't do that.
Well, ratings, there's nothing wrong with ratings.
We're old guys, I told you.
But I do agree, stories are wonderful, and I'm just going to end this portion with just a note from Grace Huntley, who said, "A wonderful book, one of my favorites. I hope there are many sequels, as there are many amazing, extraordinary Canadians." I'm not backing you into a corner about sequels, but it is a wonderful book, and I can't wait to see what the community, how they reflect on it, what they take away from it, how it intersects with their lives, how they maybe, you know, there's a sense of empathy to a lot of these stories that I think we could use right now. And it has been my honor to talk with both of you this evening and pick your brains for wow, the last hour and a half. This is not what I'm used to either when it comes to doing interviews. So this has been, it's been a beautiful thing for me. Mark Bulgutch, Peter Mansbridge, thank you so much for this.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you very much. And thank the audience too. Absolutely.
Indeed.
On behalf of One Book, One Community Waterloo Region and the Idea Exchange, I'd like to extend a huge thank you to Peter Mansbridge and Mark Bulgutch for joining us tonight to discuss Extraordinary Canadians, and to Craig Norris for an awesome interview. I'd also like to thank you, the readers and viewers of this evening's program, for your engagement, insight, and ideas over the last 20 years. I think I can speak for everyone involved with One Book, One Community when I say that we've had a lot of fun reading with you and look forward to the years of great books to come. Have a great night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.